My house went up in flames at midnight, and the person standing across the street, watching the fire swallow everything, was the same one who once told me I did not belong in this neighborhood. The fire screamed in the darkness. Windows shattered. The roof collapsed with a dry, violent crack. I stood frozen, heat blasting against my face, the stench of burning smoke mixing with memories that had not yet cooled. Neighbors cracked their doors open, some covering their mouths, others standing in silence. And in that red, raging glow, I saw Karen. She stood there with her arms crossed, posture straight, her face calm to a chilling degree. When our eyes met, she stepped forward just half a step, her voice low enough that only I could hear it.
"You should have listened to me from the beginning,"
Karen said. "There are rules here." I looked at the flames reflected in her eyes. "The law doesn't burn people's homes," I replied, my voice rough and strained. Karen curled her lips into a smile. "An accident is still an accident." She turned away, leaving me standing before the ashes that had once been everything I owned. No one knew that in that moment, I did not just lose my house. I also lost my last trace of hesitation. Karen believed she had erased me from the game. She believed that a man looked down on, standing in smoke and fire, could never stand up again. But there are identities that do not reveal themselves in a crowd. They only emerge after everything has been burned away, when there is nothing left to hide behind. This is the story of a Karen who went too far, and of the moment she walked into a courtroom, unaware that the man waiting for her there was the same one who had stood watching his home burn in the middle of the night. My house was tagged unsafe in a single morning, and the woman smiling as she signed the report was the same one who had sworn to teach me a lesson. I stood on the front steps, the smell of damp wood and burnt metal mixing in the cold air. Yellow tape stretched across the front door, fluttering lightly in the wind. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing. Some looked at me with pity. Others avoided my gaze, as if afraid of being dragged down with me. I heard the inspector's vehicle start up, the scratch of a pen signing paper, and above it all, her sharp voice, decisive and without a trace of hesitation. She was the newly appointed HOA president. Everyone called her Karen, not behind her back, but even as she stood there, hair stiffly curled, light-colored coat on, arms crossed, like a self-appointed judge. She said the house was a danger to the community. She said I had violated regulations. She said the HOA had a duty to protect order. Every sentence was punctuated by a thin smile, the kind worn by someone who believed they held the power of life and death in their hands. No one asked if I had anything to say. In fact, they probably assumed I did not. To them, I was just a middle-aged man who bought an old house at the edge of the neighborhood, renovating slowly, keeping to himself. I wore a worn jacket, shoes dusted with paint. I did not look influential. I did not look intimidating. And I certainly did not look like someone Karen needed to worry about. When the warning sign was nailed to the door, I felt my chest tighten. Not from fear, but from anger held tightly in check. That house was not just four walls. It was meant to become a temporary refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. It was the last project I began after my wife passed away, a way to keep myself from sinking into the emptiness. And now, with just a few dry words, Karen had turned all of it into a threat that needed to be removed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "I told you already, we have laws here. And the law is not on your side." Her eyes lit up, as if this were the moment she had been waiting for. I nodded, offering no resistance. My silence pleased her. She turned and walked away quickly, her heels striking hard against the concrete, leaving behind the unmistakable feeling of victory. But in my mind, a different thought was forming. I remembered the first HOA meeting, when Karen stood before the residents and spoke about order, about safety, about cleaning up the neighborhood. I remembered the eyes of a few elderly residents sitting at the back, People who had lived here for decades and now feared every fine notice they received. I remembered the way Karen emphasized the word regulations, as if it were a weapon. They did not know who I was. None of them knew what I actually did for a living. I had grown used to being underestimated. For years, I learned to listen more than I spoke, to observe more than I reacted. Real power does not need to show itself. It waits for the right moment. As the crowd slowly dispersed, an older man approached me. He looked at the warning sign and sighed. "She did this to my house last year," he said quietly. I didn't have the strength to fight back. In his eyes was exhaustion, but also a fragile hint of hope, as if my presence there reminded him that he was not entirely alone. I placed my hand on the sealed door, feeling the cold wood beneath my palm. I was not angry the way they thought I was. I was calculating. Karen believed this was the end. The HOA believed I would leave quietly, like the others before me. But they were wrong. What they had just done was open another door, one where the truth would step into the light. I turned away from the house and took a deep breath, letting the cold air steady my heartbeat. The game was only beginning, and this time, the law would be applied the way it was meant to be. The next violation notice arrived just 3 days later, slapped directly onto my car window like a public warning. I stood in the parking lot, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Red ink stamped cold lines across the page, listing violation after violation I had never even heard of. Railings not up to code, paint color not uniform, improperly stored materials. Each item came with a clearly stated fine, precise to the point of being emotionless. I did not need to finish reading to understand the message beneath it. This was no longer a reminder. This was an attack. Karen appeared right on cue, as if she had been waiting. She stepped out of the mobile HOA office, parked at the end of the block, a thick folder in her arms. Her eyes swept over me and settled on the notice in my hand. "You see," she said, her voice flat but filled with quiet satisfaction. "We're just following procedure." I glanced around. A few neighbors stood at a distance, pretending to be busy, but their ears were tuned to every word. I saw the worry in their eyes. They had received letters like this before. They knew exactly where it led. I asked Karen, calmly, why none of these issues had been mentioned during the previous inspection. She curled her lips. "The law is always changing. If you can't keep up, that's your problem." Her words dropped into the silence like a blade. A young woman standing nearby lowered her head, her hand tightening around her purse. I knew she was thinking about her own letter. That evening, I sat alone in the temporary house, yellow light casting long shadows across unfinished walls. I spread the notices across the table. Every single one carried Karen's signature. The same handwriting, the same absolute certainty. I could feel her confidence pressed into every stroke of ink. Karen believed she was untouchable. I began to read more carefully, not out of fear, but to understand the structure of the attack. Payment deadlines had been shortened without explanation. The appeal process was redirected to an office that did not exist. Several cited regulations had been obsolete for years. Small details, easy to miss at a glance, but to me, they lit up like warning signals. The next day, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Karen stood before everyone, her voice echoing through the community room. She spoke about safety, about responsibility, about how no individual was allowed to place personal interests above the good of the community. Her eyes flicked toward me now and then, as if reminding everyone who truly held power. I sat in the back row, my shoulders against the wall, listening to every word. I saw reluctant nods. I saw fear disguised as silence. When Karen asked if anyone objected, the room fell completely quiet. She smiled, the smile of someone who had just claimed another victory. After the meeting, a man approached me. He whispered, his eyes darting toward the door. "She did this to my house last year," he said. "The fines were so bad I had to sell." His voice shook, not with anger, but with helplessness. A woman beside him nodded, her lips pressed tight. They did not dare speak louder. They had learned the cost of speaking up. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by the window, watching streetlights reflect off the glass. In my mind, the pieces began to connect. Karen did not just want fines. She wanted control. And to get it, she was willing to bend the law until it became her personal tool. They thought I was just a stubborn homeowner. They did not know that reading laws, analyzing procedures, and waiting for the right moment had been part of my daily life for years. I had seen people far more powerful than Karen fall because of their own blind confidence. As I gathered the notices and stacked them neatly, a quiet decision took shape. I would not confront her head-on. I would not shout in meetings. I would let Karen keep believing she was winning, because the faster she thought she was winning, the more cracks she would reveal. Outside, the neighborhood was strangely quiet, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent had begun to move. And I knew that soon enough, Karen would realize these violation letters were not the final blow, but an invitation into a game whose rules she did not fully understand. I discovered that the HOA had not carried insurance for the neighborhood for years on a rainy afternoon when a thin folder slipped out of an unlocked cabinet they had forgotten to secure. It was not a break-in. I had been invited inside. Karen was overly confident. She thought showing me a few random documents would overwhelm me and make me back off. But that carelessness opened a gap, and I stepped through it without hesitation. The HOA office was small, smelling of old paper and cold coffee. I sat alone, turning page after page. The financial reports were neatly printed, clean and orderly, but there were strange gaps. Large expense entries with no invoices attached. Insurance mentioned only in vague lines, no policy numbers, no company names. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from realizing just how reckless they had been. If anything happened, a fire, an accident, the entire neighborhood would be completely exposed, and Karen, the person who always spoke the loudest about safety, had allowed exactly that to happen. I did not tell anyone right away. I took the discovery home and placed it beside the stack of violation notices. The pieces began to fit together, fines rising rapidly, rules changing constantly. The HOA needed money, not for the community, but to cover a hole they were trying to hide. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Karen chose her targets, not the large houses, not the families with personal attorneys, but the elderly, the newly moved in, those unfamiliar with the process. I heard whispered conversations over fences, tired sighs after each meeting. People were afraid, and that fear fed Karen's power. One evening, as I was taking notes, there was a soft knock at the door. A middle-aged woman stood outside, clutching her coat tightly. She looked around before speaking. "I heard you're looking into the HOA." Her voice trembled. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a copy of an old email, one where Karen demanded an urgent transfer of funds to a familiar contractor. Without any vote, the amount was large enough to make any reasonable person hesitate. Yet it was framed as an emergency that could not be delayed. I looked at the woman. In her eyes was fear of being discovered, but also the exhaustion of someone who had endured too much for too long. "I can't say this publicly," she said, "but I can't pretend I didn't see it anymore." I thanked her. When the door closed, I sat still for a long time. What I was holding was not just evidence. It was the silenced voice of an entire community. Karen continued playing her role. She sent more letters, held more meetings, talked about responsibility and discipline. Each time, she grew more certain she was in control of the game. She had no idea that behind her, small pieces of paper were coming together into a much larger picture, and it was not a pleasant one. There were moments when I wondered if I should stop. Life would be easier if I sold the house, moved away, and forgot everything. But whenever I thought of the bowed heads in the meeting room, I kept going. This was no longer just about me. Late one night, when the city had gone to sleep, I sat at my computer and reviewed the legal provisions again. I moved quickly, almost by instinct. Legal language did not tire me. It was a familiar tongue. I knew exactly where the HOA had crossed the line, where Karen had abused her authority. I also knew how to force the system to look. They still thought I was just a stubborn homeowner, pushing back against the HOA out of pride. They did not know I was moving one step at a time, slow and precise, the same way I did in my real work. Power does not lie in giving orders. It lies in knowing when to remain silent. The next morning, as Karen stood before everyone again, her voice loud and firm, I looked at her and realized something. She was not dangerous because she was greedy. She was dangerous because she believed she could not be touched. And that is always the most fatal mistake. I gathered the files and closed the drawer. The game had moved beyond words. From this point on, every step Karen took would be recorded, not with emotion, but with truth. Karen did not wait for me to collapse. She actively pushed me to the edge. The morning after the property was sealed, I received another notice pasted directly over the old one. White paper still smelling of fresh ink, bold letters reading like a sentence being handed down. Another violation, another fine, another deadline shortened to the point of absurdity. I stood reading it on the porch of the temporary place I was staying, the wind flipping the corner of the paper, Karen's thin laugh from the most recent meeting echoing in my head. She did not just want control. She wanted to prove that I had no place here. The HOA meeting took place that evening. The community room was cramped, fluorescent lights casting a cold glow. Karen stood at the front, back straight, one hand resting on the podium as if it belonged to her. When I walked in, a few eyes glanced at me and quickly turned away. No one offered me a seat. Karen began speaking immediately, without waiting for everyone to arrive. She listed my violations in a smooth voice, like she was reading off a grocery list. Each sentence ended with a firm nod, as if hammering another nail into place. I stood up when it was my turn to speak. No microphone, no notes, just my voice, low and steady, carrying far enough to be heard. I spoke about procedure, about authority, about how no one could make decisions alone and then call it consensus. Karen smiled. She tilted her head, as if watching a child argue with an adult. You're wasting everyone's time, she said. We already voted. I asked when the vote took place, who was present, where the minutes were. The room fell silent. A few people lowered their heads. Karen tapped the podium lightly, the sound sharp and final. The meeting is over, she declared. The matter has been resolved. I left under looks mixed with fear and curiosity. Outside, the parking lot was growing dark. I knew I had just brushed against Karen's ego, and I also knew that for people like her, that was unforgivable. Over the next few days, everything accelerated. Inspectors came and went. Fines increased. An anonymous complaint appeared, alleging a safety hazard. I began to see the pattern. Everything bore the imprint of one person, even though her name never appeared on paper. Karen always stood behind it all, clean, confident, like someone who had never gotten her hands dirty. One afternoon, I saw her across the street, speaking with a stranger in a dark jacket. They both looked toward my house. Karen pointed briefly. The man nodded. When I stepped closer, they separated, as if they had never been standing together. Karen turned back to me and smiled. You're still here, she said. I thought you understood the message. What message? I asked. That there are places where you're not welcome. That night, I did not sleep. Not from fear, but from instinct. I walked around the house, checking windows, locks, trash bins. Nothing was out of place. But the silence felt too perfect. I sat down on the front step, listening to insects and the distant sound of passing cars. I thought about the people who had left before me, about how Karen always won without ever getting her hands dirty. Close to midnight, a strange smell drifted through the air, faint, sharp. I jumped to my feet. The wind shifted. A small light flickered in a hidden corner. Then, another, like eyes opening in the dark. I ran. Glass shattered behind me. Flames erupted with terrifying speed, licking up the wooden walls as if they had been invited. I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by explosions and heat. In the chaos, I saw a figure across the street. Not panicking, not running, just standing there, watching. Karen. The firelight reflected on her face, revealing an emotion she always kept hidden. Not anger, not fear, but the cold satisfaction of someone who believed she had just erased an obstacle. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the house was nothing but a blackened skeleton. I stood shaking in the smoke, listening to questions fly at me. Accident, electrical fault, carelessness. Familiar words began to surface, like a blanket laid over the truth. Karen disappeared before anyone thought to look for her. I stared at the ashes, my chest tightening, not because of material loss, but because a line had been crossed. Karen had chosen a road with no turning back, and I understood that from this moment on, the story was no longer about the HOA or regulations. It was about accountability, and about who would pay the price when the flames finally died out. The police concluded it was an accident after just one morning, and the fire was labeled an unfortunate incident before the ashes had even cooled. I stood in front of the temporary fence, watching the last strands of smoke dissolve into the air. The smell of burning clung to my clothes, my hair, my memories. An officer spoke about the possibility of an electrical fault, about old materials, about unpredictable risks. He spoke quickly, as if eager to be done. I nodded and signed the confirmation form, my hand steady enough to surprise even myself. There are moments when calm is not acceptance. It is the only way to keep the mind from shattering. Neighbors gathered in a loose circle. Some cried. Some avoided eye contact. An elderly woman held my hand and whispered, trembling, that she had seen headlights stop briefly across the street, then disappear. She spoke softly, afraid. I thanked her and did not ask more. I knew fear was suffocating the entire neighborhood. Karen had taught them how to stay silent, with paperwork and smiles. That afternoon, Karen appeared. She wore an expression of carefully rehearsed regret. She said she was deeply sorry. She said the HOA would consider offering support. She said accidents were never what anyone wanted. Every sentence landed perfectly, timed like stones paving her escape. I looked at her and saw that her eyes were not red. Not a crack. Not a single missed beat. "You'll be fine," she said, placing a hand on her chest as if making a vow. "We'll follow proper procedure." I nodded. "Procedure," I repeated softly. Karen smiled, pleased by my lack of resistance. She turned away, leaving behind a faint trace of perfume and a chill that ran down my spine. That night, I did not return to the temporary place I was staying. I sat in my car, parked a few blocks away from the burned house. I watched, not to hunt for a culprit in the dark, but to listen to the neighborhood breathe after the shock. Near dawn, a car rolled by slowly, its lights off for a brief moment. I took note, just noted it. Some details do not need immediate explanations. In the days that followed, I began collecting fragments, not charred wood or twisted metal. I collected stories. A delivery driver said he had been asked to change routes that night. A young man said his home security camera had been shut off for maintenance on that exact evening. An HOA report had its date altered. A signature placed over empty space. Each piece was small, disconnected, but placed side by side, they formed a familiar outline. Karen accelerated her efforts. She pushed the HOA to decide on demolishing what remained of the house, citing safety concerns. She sent letters demanding I leave the neighborhood sooner. She said it was to protect the community. I stayed silent. My silence made her more confident. She did not realize that silence is sometimes the best way to let others keep making mistakes. One morning, I received a call from the insurance company. The representative hesitated as they spoke. mentioning inconsistencies, traces of accelerant, the timing of the ignition, an independent report they had just received. I thanked them and asked that everything be sent in writing. When the call ended, I looked up at the clear blue sky and let out a slow breath. The first gear had begun to turn. That evening, I opened an old file I had kept hidden for years. Not personal records, but professional notes, principles I had lived by for a long time. I was used to looking at chaos and finding order. I was used to hearing convincing lies. Real power does not come from speaking louder. It comes from knowing how to wait for the right moment. Karen believed the fire had closed the story. She believed fear would make me disappear. But in the ashes, some things do not burn. Patience, memory, and a truth that was slowly taking shape, piece by piece, despite every twisted procedure. I closed the file and stood up. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. I knew that from here on, the rhythm of the story would change. No longer chasing the flames, but walking straight into the light. The independent report reached me on a rainy morning, and the very first conclusion was enough to make every earlier excuse collapse. Not an accident, not an electrical fault. Traces of accelerant were clearly visible in every layer of ash. The time of ignition matched perfectly with an unusual gap in the camera footage. I read slowly, letting each word settle. Rain tapped steadily against the car window, like a heartbeat finally returning to normal after sleepless nights. I did not smile. I did not shake. I only knew that the truth had found its way. I began taking small steps, making calls, sending letters, asking the right questions in the right places. No one noticed anything unusual about the man in a worn jacket, speaking calmly and sparingly. They were used to underestimating me, and I let them. In a world run by people who crave control, the underestimated person is always the greatest threat. A camera technician eventually agreed to talk. He lowered his head, his voice quiet, and said he had received an emergency maintenance request, approved with an HOA signature. The timing fit perfectly, too perfectly. I thanked him and did not record the conversation. Some confessions need protection in order to carry weight. Later, across the neighborhood, Karen was holding an emergency meeting. She spoke about safety, about responsibility, about the need to clear away what remained of the burned house to avoid risk. She spoke quickly and decisively, leaving no room for questions. One man stood up to object. Karen looked at him, her gaze icy. The meeting ended earlier than expected. As people filed out, I saw the familiar fear return to their faces. Karen still believed she was leading. I met the elderly woman who had whispered to me that night. She trembled as she spoke again about the headlights. This time, she was not alone. Her son sat beside her, silent but resolute. I made no promises. I only listened. Sometimes the only thing a person needs to tell the truth is to know they will not be abandoned. The pieces slowly fell into place. Meeting schedules altered. Forwarded emails, missing recipients. An unusual expense marked with vague notes. I arranged them into a straight line. No speculation. Just sequence. The truth does not need decoration. It is sharp enough on its own. Karen began to sense something. She called me, for the first time in weeks. Her voice was softer. She spoke of compromise, of settling things quietly. She said no one wanted to drag this out. I listened without interrupting. When she asked what I wanted, I answered simply, I want everything to be recorded correctly. Silence stretched on the other end of the line. Then Karen laughed, a strained sound. You're playing a dangerous game, she said. You don't understand who you're dealing with. I hung up. No argument was needed. People who believe they are untouchable always say that just before the wall comes down. That evening, I reopened my professional file, not to remind myself who I was, but to ground myself in principle. Justice is not rushed. It accumulates. It is patient. And when it is full, it arrives at the right time, in the right place, with the right weight. I sent a package of documents. Not to the press, not to the HOA, but to a place I had known for a very long time. A place that knows how to read between the lines. A place not swayed by smiles or titles. I did not sign my name boldly. I did not need to. Night fell. The rain had stopped. The neighborhood was quiet, as if holding its breath. I stood under the awning, watching the wet road reflect the streetlights. Somewhere, Karen was probably sleeping soundly, believing everything was still under control. She did not know that the largest gear had begun to turn, and once it moves, no apology comes fast enough to stop it. I closed the door and turned off the light. The truth was already on its way. The rest was only a matter of time. The summons was issued on a blazing midday, and within just 1 hour, the entire neighborhood was buzzing as if thunder had struck out of a clear sky. No one spoke loudly. News traveled through glances, quick nods, windows closing earlier than usual. Karen still appeared as she always did, neatly dressed, walking with decisive steps. But this time, something was different. She did not stop to chat. She did not smile. The phone in her hand vibrated constantly, and each time she glanced down, the corners of her mouth tightened a little more. That evening's HOA meeting was unusually crowded. Not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Karen stepped up to the podium, ready to begin her familiar speech. But a man stood up before she could start. His voice trembled, but he did not back down. He asked about the expense for camera repairs. A woman followed, asking about deleted emails. One question led to another. Karen raised her hand to demand order, but the room had already shifted. Those who had once stayed silent now began to speak, piece by piece, like heavy rain falling all at once. Karen tried to remain calm. She smiled and said everything would be clarified. She called it a misunderstanding. She said someone was manipulating public opinion. When she used the word manipulating, a few eyes turned toward me, then quickly looked away. I sat in the back row, saying nothing. I did not need to. The truth had stood up in my place. The meeting ended in chaos. No vote. No conclusion. Karen left early, walking so fast it was almost a run. I followed at a distance, far enough not to draw attention. In the parking lot, she stopped to take a call. The wind carried her voice to me. Broken, but clear enough. "This can't be happening," she said. "They have nothing." I followed proper procedure. She hung up and stood still for a long moment. Her shoulders sagged in a rare instant without an audience. Then she straightened and walked on. Karen always believed that as long as she stood tall, everything would fall back into order. In the days that followed, interviews began, not with the press, but in closed rooms, under white lights, voices flat and methodical. A camera technician, a bank employee, a resident who had signed without reading carefully. Each person walked out looking lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Karen, on the other hand, began to look worn. Dark circles formed under her eyes, her thin smile nearly disappearing. I was called in as a witness. No one introduced who I was. I did not ask them to. I answered questions briefly and precisely. I laid out the sequence, without speculation. I spoke about timing, about traces, about gaps that could not be explained. In that room, I was not a victim. I was a witness to the truth. And the truth does not need emotion to carry weight. Karen called me again. Her voice no longer soft. It was sharp, rushed. She said I was destroying her life. She said I did not understand the consequences. I listened, then replied in the calmest voice I had. "You burned my house." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Then, she laughed loudly. The sound fractured. "You can't prove it," she said. "No one will believe you." I hung up. Not out of anger, but because I did not need to convince her. She had chosen to believe the one thing still keeping her upright: denial. The day Karen received the court order, the sky was overcast. I saw her step out of her house, a white envelope in her hand, her trembling fingers unable to hide it. Neighbors watched through their curtains. No one spoke, no one smiled. This silence was not born of fear. It was anticipation. That evening, I sat alone, rereading my final notes. I thought about the moment the house burned, about the smell of smoke, about the fire reflected in Karen's eyes. Some images never fade, but they no longer weighed me down. They had become fuel, reminding me that justice does not arrive on its own. It needs people willing to stand firm when everything begins to shake. Tomorrow, Karen would walk into a different room, governed by different rules, where smiles and titles offered no protection. She did not know that yet. She still believed she was controlling the story, but the story had changed direction long ago, and this time, no one could turn off the light shining straight at the truth. Karen entered the week before the trial carrying the confidence of someone who believed every door was still in her hands. She appeared everywhere. At her lawyer's office, in private meetings with residents, on phone calls that stretched late into the night. Her voice shifted from soft to hard, changing like a double-edged blade. To one person, she was the victim of a conspiracy. To another, she was a betrayed leader. She did not sleep much, but she never allowed herself to look weak. Karen always believed that as long as she maintained the image, the truth would shrink on its own. Meanwhile, I vanished from her view. No meetings, no conversations, no responses. My absence irritated Karen more than any direct provocation ever could. She was used to pulling her opponents into her own vortex. When there was no one to pull, she began to spin on her own. One afternoon, her lawyer called me. His voice was polite and professional, speaking about the possibility of a settlement. He mentioned exhaustion, time, unnecessary consequences. I listened to everything. Then I asked a single question. "Have you read the fire investigation report?" Silence filled the line. He said he would call back. That call never came. Karen began to change tactics. She sent an apology letter, not an admission of guilt, just an apology for misunderstandings. She said she never wanted things to go this far. She said she was willing to help me rebuild. I read the letter very slowly, not because I was moved, but because I realized this was the first time Karen had written something she could not take back with words alone. In the neighborhood, the atmosphere shifted. People who once avoided me now met my eyes more directly. A few stopped by to ask if I was doing all right. Some whispered that they had been called in as witnesses. Others said they had finally slept through the night. Fear had not disappeared overnight, but it no longer held command. The night before the trial, I sat alone in a quiet room. Neatly arranged files lay on the table. Nothing was new. Everything had been ready for a long time. I did not review details. I simply sat and remembered what it felt like to stand in front of the burning house. The searing heat, the emptiness, and the moment I understood that, if I let this pass, I would never be myself again. Karen was the opposite. She hosted a small dinner, trying to preserve a sense of normalcy. She laughed loudly, saying everything would be fine. But after everyone left, she sat alone for a long time. She called someone and could not finish a full sentence. Some fears do not need names. They only need darkness to grow. The next morning, Karen chose her most formal outfit. She stood before the mirror, adjusting her collar, taking a deep breath. In the reflection, she still saw a woman accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. She believed the trial was just a procedure, another stage where she could speak. Karen had always trusted her ability to talk. As for me, I arrived very early. No one noticed. No one asked questions. I walked down the long hallway, white lights reflecting off the floor. Each step echoed softly, steady, and even. I did not think about Karen. I thought about order. About things finally returning to their proper place. In the waiting room, Karen sat with her back straight, one hand resting on her handbag. She looked around, searching for something familiar. She did not see me. That reassured her. She turned to her lawyer and nodded, as if to calm herself. Everything was still under control. At least, she believed it was. When the courtroom doors opened, everyone stood. Karen walked in without looking forward right away. She was busy flipping through her papers, preparing the lines she had rehearsed. She did not know that the next moment would be the final moment of that belief. I sat in my seat, back straight, hands resting calmly on the table. I did not look at Karen as she entered. I waited until everyone had settled, until the silence grew thick enough. Some truths need just the right pause before they speak for themselves. Karen believed she was about to face an unfamiliar system. She had no idea that the person about to call her name was the same man who had once stood in smoke and fire, watching his home collapse. And when the truth entered the room, it did not knock. It simply sat down, calmly, and waited for its turn. Karen realized too late that this room was not her stage, but the place where every mask would be stripped away. When the clerk called the case, Karen stood up, forcing herself to maintain a confident stride. She adjusted her handbag, cast a quick glance at her lawyer, then lifted her eyes toward the bench. And in that exact moment, her face went rigid. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught. She saw me, not in the witness box, not on the opposing side. I was seated exactly where she had never imagined I would be. Back straight, expression calm. The room fell silent for a single breath. I heard the faint scrape of a chair shifting, as if the entire space were trying to remain perfectly still. Karen swallowed hard. She looked away, then looked up again, as if hoping her vision had betrayed her. But I was still there, unmoved, unhidden, needing no introduction. The trial began. The reading of the charges was steady, each detail dropping like a heavy stone. Deliberate arson, fraudulent records, abuse of authority, concealment of evidence. Karen shook her head repeatedly, lips pressed tight. Her lawyer stood to object, voice sharp and fast, familiar in its urgency. I listened. I let them finish. Haste is always the mark of someone afraid of losing control. When it was my turn to question, I stood. No one in the room knew who I was, but they knew I did not need to prove it. I asked about the camera maintenance schedule. Karen answered smoothly. I presented the time logs. She slowed. I asked about the rushed approval of an expense. She said it was procedure. I presented a forwarded email, missing its recipients. She looked down at the paper, her hand trembling slightly. Witnesses were called. The camera technician, the delivery driver, the elderly neighbor. They did not speak loudly. They did not speak long. But every statement aligned with the one before it. The pieces formed a picture with no gaps left. Karen began to react sharply. She interrupted. She objected. She claimed everyone was colluding against her. Her voice rose, grew sharper, losing the polish that had once been her weapon. I presented the fire investigation report. Traces of accelerant, the time of ignition, the direction of the wind. I did not emphasize anything. I did not need to. The truth applies its own pressure. Karen's lawyer asked for a recess. Karen lowered her head, whispering something, but no one could rescue her from what she had done. For a brief moment, Karen turned to look at me, her eyes a mix of fury and pleading. She opened her mouth, as if to speak. I looked back at her directly. No resentment, no pity, only the presence of someone who had walked through fire and come out intact. When I concluded my questioning, my voice remained even. I spoke of sequence, of responsibility, of how power is not a shield for crime. I did not mention the house. I did not mention the night of the fire. I did not need to. Everyone in the room had already seen those flames through testimony and evidence. Karen collapsed into her chair as the gavel struck. The dry sound cut through every unfinished defense. The court concluded the proceedings. Subsequent measures were announced. Karen could no longer sit upright. Her shoulders sagged, as if she were finally bearing the full weight of what she had caused. I stayed a few seconds after everyone else had left. The courtroom slowly emptied. Light filtered through the high windows, pale and cold. I took a deep breath. There was no sense of victory, only a peace that arrived late. When I stepped into the hallway, I did not look back. Karen had chosen her path on the night the flames rose. Today, that path ended here, and for the first time in a long while, I knew that what had been lost no longer demanded revenge. It only needed to be called by its true name. Karen was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, in silence. And in that moment, every illusion that power could survive once the lights were turned on came to an end. No one cheered. No one applauded. There was only the sound of shoes striking the floor, steady and cold, echoing down the hallway. Karen walked slowly, her back no longer straight, her eyes hollow, as if she had dropped something that could never be recovered. I stood at a measured distance, neither stepping closer nor turning away. Some endings need no words. They close themselves when every role has been played. Outside, the clouds parted and sunlight fell softly onto the stone steps. Those who had attended the trial drifted away quietly, each carrying their own thoughts. I heard a few relieved breaths. I saw an older man wipe his eyes. I saw a woman grip her child's hand tightly, as if reminding herself that some things are still right in the world, even if they take a long time. I returned to the neighborhood that afternoon. There was no more caution tape, no more official vehicles, only silent houses and an empty space where my old home once stood. I stopped and rested my hand on the temporary fence. The wind passed through, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. There was no smell of smoke, no sound of explosions, just a silence large enough to listen to myself. The HOA board was replaced. Meetings became shorter, with fewer slogans and more questions. People began to read what they signed more carefully. They started asking who benefited from rushed decisions, not because they suddenly became braver, but because they had seen what happens when fear is abused. I declined any role on the new board. I did not become the face of any movement. I had done what needed to be done. The rest belonged to the community. Justice does not need a hero standing on stage forever. It needs ordinary people willing to stand upright when their moment comes. Rebuilding moved slowly. Not to recreate the past, but to open something new. I chose each material, each detail, with a patience I had never had before. Every hammer strike landed evenly, unhurried. Some afternoons, neighbors stopped by with hot coffee, saying little. Their presence was enough. On the first night the new house had electricity again, I sat alone on the front steps, watching the light spill onto the quiet road. I thought about Karen, not with hatred, but with a late understanding. She believed control was strength. She believed rules were tools. But rules, when applied properly, do not belong to any one person. They belong to everyone. I also thought about the moments of being underestimated, the dismissive looks, the silence so often mistaken for weakness. Some forms of power need no introduction. They exist in the ability to wait, in preparation, in letting the truth speak for itself. If you have followed this story all the way here, perhaps you have stood before a system that made you feel small. Perhaps you were told to stay silent because your voice did not matter. If so, remember that silence is only a temporary strategy, not the ending. When the time comes, the truth will find its way to speak. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell your story, even if it is only a few lines. If this story made you believe a little more in standing up at the right moment, press like and follow so you do not miss the next ones. Because every time a truth is told, the world takes one small step closer to justice.